Hello and welcome to episode. What are we doing now, Lee? Is this 6 or 7?
I don't know. I'm not into counting really.
Fair enough. Welcome back to Mile High Mana. The usual hosts here. We got Grant and Lee. Last episode, we had Joe Nunez come on and talk about how much of a badass Magic player he is, and then we went on like basically what was it, 3 week hiatus or something like that. Got a lot of life stuff to catch you guys up on.
Yeah, we certainly do. But this could be a long one. But so strap in. I'm excited.
Yeah, and if this does end up running long, maybe we split it into two parts. Who knows? But yeah, cool. So a little bit of an update on my side. Started a new job. Just been super busy. Also just trying to stay afloat with all the formats I still give a shit about in Magic. But I've been busy. I know Lee, you've been crazy busy. You've barely even been home the past month. So yeah, we're trying to make this happen. Trying to get this one squeezed in so that you guys can have the content. I appreciate all the feedback everyone's given us so far. I've gotten a few texts and some notes about how our podcast has been really helpful for other folks to just add to their content library, and I know Lee's had a couple conversations with a few people too. So appreciate the feedback. Keep it coming. If there's anything you want to see us do or talk about, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to work that into the agenda. But for today, we're going to sort of treat this like a State of the Union, sort of state of Magic address. We're going to walk through a few different formats and then Magic as a whole. But Lee, I'll flip it over to you if you want to do any other sort of front end work here.
No, I mean I've been home 4 days out of the last like 14, and I've played 3 Magic events. So you can tell where my priorities are when I have the time.
For sure. Yeah, I can't blame you. Well, cool. I want to start off by giving out about three shout outs here. We needed to catch up on a few things too, but a couple weeks back, Amy James, friend of the show, local to Denver, won the Grandmaster Games RCQ. So congrats to Amy. I've referred to them now as Amy Steelcutter because they won on Is It Prowess. And then over the weekend, we had two major standouts at the RC. We had Casey Miller. Also, I believe they're located in Colorado Springs, but frequents many of the Denver events. Got first place at the RC, locking up a Worlds invite, a Pro Tour invite, bunch of cash, a bunch of other stuff. Really exciting to see. And then we also had Kobe Keller also get a Pro Tour invite as well. Very cool to see. Lee, what are your thoughts?
I mean, watching Casey just crush the RC after he won his RC invite, beating me in the finals was poetic justice. I loved it. I was locked in as soon as I got back from playing Legacy yesterday. I went back and watched the rest of the coverage, watched the rest of the top eight. Casey and I have played a ton. I think we talked about our matches even on the first or second episode of this podcast, how we've played a whole bunch this year. Our teams have matched up. He and I were both locked in on standard for most of the MMS team trio stuff that we played. He and I played in a couple of RCQs against each other. And then he actually got his invite, when he beat me in the finals with that green white Calyx and Chanties deck, right? So it was just amazing to see somebody that I've sat across the table from a whole bunch this year just wipe the floor with everybody at the convention center in Minneapolis. And, that Jeskai control deck was like kind of right in his wheelhouse. He like started off playing the mono white caretaker, kind of white mono white control deck in standard. He's played a bunch of slower control the board white card decks for the entire year. And this one just seemed right up his alley. I know he had done some testing with Joe when Joe was prepping for the regional championship, and I think a couple other folks on that team were pretty locked in on playing Is It Prowess, which I think was a super safe bet if you look at the tournament in retrospect. But Casey on the final interview, when he was talking to Nick Miller, just said, "Hey, I just built the deck to beat all those prowess decks, and I hoped I got paired into them." And he did. If you look at his record, on MTG Melee, he got paired into prowess a bunch and came completely prepared to win that matchup. I think his deck list had 4 temporary lockdowns, 2 other sweepers, I think one Day of Judgment and one split up, and 4 Lightning Helix, right? Like he just came 100% locked in to say, hey, this is what I'm going to play and this is what I'm going to beat. And he did, right? So I don't know. The whole thing was just awesome to watch.
Definitely. I also went back and watched a little bit of the top eight coverage, and the Jeskai deck to me just felt like if it got its mana under it, it was going to win basically every game. If it didn't die in the first 2 or 3 turns, got nice clean mana rollout, like it just seemed very, very powerful. And then just the ability to go like stock up, Shiko, stock up, or like, stock up into Shiko into temporary lockdown. It just like it was quite the value pile.
Yeah, and he knew when to commit to the board. He knew when to pass with mana up where he figured out where he needed to interact. I saw him use the new red Korim Monastery, whatever that land is where you can like tap for and like play a card next turn. I saw him use that land more effectively than anybody else that I'd seen in the tournament. And I would imagine that he understood that that was the weakness of the deck, right? The 3 color mana bases in standard have like always been pretty sketchy. And it would not surprise me if, when we talk to him later this week or next week or whenever I see him next, that he would say that, yeah, I mulliganed to hands where I knew the mana would work, and then, I'd figure it out from there. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Congrats to him. I didn't look at see what deck Kobe played. Did you?
Kobe was on Is It Prowess. After I talked to Cora yesterday at Legacy, and she said that Kobe had lost. Like I think Kobe was like 9-1 or something going into round 11, and I think Kobe lost like a couple of win-ins in a row, which is obviously brutal. We talked to Joe about him losing a few win-ins in a row at the SCG Con Denver, but Kobe still locked up the PT invite, which I always just imagine like I might as well have gotten first if I'm locking up the PT invite. And that's how at least I would feel.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be goal number one, right? I think the one thing that is easy to not totally grasp if you've like never played one of these really large events, let's say more than 1,000 players, right? And like actually made a run where you were in contention, is that when you get to be 9-1, you're also getting paired into a bunch of players who are also 9-1, right? So like these events that go on for 10, 11, 12, 13 rounds, the last 4 rounds are like literally running the gauntlet because you're playing against a bunch of killers. So try, it's hard, but like try not to get discouraged when you find losses kind of at the end of the tournament, because you're literally playing the best people in the room on that day, and that's just going to go on. That's just the nature of Swiss tournaments that are big. It's just a totally fundamentally different setup is that you would have in an RCQ where you're going to play 5 rounds and go to top 8. So yeah, congrats to them both. Congrats to Amy winning the RCQ. Like, it's fun to see the Denver locals like just straight up crush it.
I think that's 3 RCs in a row that had a Denver local featured in the finals.
Well, and Matt won the Pro Tour.
And Mount Rummel won the Pro Tour. Yeah,
Not a bad
wild.
showing.
Yeah, definitely not. I think that's probably a good place for us to transition into State of Standard. Like per usual, I'll let you sort of take the wheel on this one, but how do you feel about Standard? And I want to look at this whole episode as sort of a lens of being a player and enjoying this hobby and things. You're going to hear a lot of negativity today, unfortunately. You're also going to hear a lot of positivity too in certain areas that it didn't exist before. But I think Lee and I both have a lot of thoughts and a lot of very different thoughts about where Magic's at today. And I think we should start with Standard.
Yeah, sure. We can start with standard. I heard people like when we disagree, so I'm not afraid of that. I will say though, I think standard is in a worse place now than it was prior to the printing of Chorus Steel Cutter. I think Chorus Steel Cutter is going to end up being one of those cards that goes in the infamy pile in my binder of like banned cards that look like, Ren and Six and Dreadhorde Arcanist and all these cards that do two things at the same time that at 2 mana kind of fundamentally breaks a lot of formats. And those two things are the application of tempo on as early as turn 2, meaning that you like move your board position forward in a meaningful way and generate card advantage over time, right? This is exactly what Ren and Six does, picking up lands every turn if you can convert them into useful things. This is exactly what Dreadhorde Arcanist did before, where you could play a thing on turn 2 that was inherently difficult to kill and generated cards every turn. So like this is the type of formula that you get to when cards become problematic. And I posted a thing in the Discord a couple of weeks ago that Yuta Takahashi said it was the best 2-drop ever printed, and it generated a bunch of discussion and a bunch of banter back and forth about comparing it to Time Walk. But that kind of puts it in perspective for you. Like, not the fact that, you could argue those two things, but the fact that that's even a discussion I think is pretty relevant. So I think the standard format card pool is small enough that it's going to inherently just warp around a card like that. And it definitely has. If you looked at the RC that was held in Bologna, I think 25% of the room, which was the first major tournament when it was printed, was already locked in on Is It Prowess. Move forward a week to Minneapolis, I believe 33% of people in the room registered a Chorus Steel Cutter Is It Prowess deck, and that conversion rate on day two went up with a positive win rate. I believe it was 36% of decks in day two where Is It Prowess with Chorus Steel Cutter. So I think the format has now kind of warped and or broken depending on your perspective around this new proactive positive tempo card advantage engine that was introduced to the format. But again, that's the format that we have, and it's kind of crazy to watch how fast Magic moves now. I think if this type of thing would have occurred, let's say, for example, during the original Cons of Tarkir, it would have taken people a month, maybe 6 or 8 weeks to really catch on to what's going on. But you now have, impressively, I think, built an entire community of people who are invested in going to RCQs, who are invested to go into RC. Everybody's locked in, looking at deck lists, playing on Magic Online, grinding it out, trying to figure out. And the card was printed, and the very first tournament it was legal, 25% of the room was on it. And the very next weekend, 35% of the people were on it, right? So Magic moves in a way that is extremely efficient and fast compared to what it has at any other point in history, which means that fundamentally the decks get faster, the decks get more efficient, the decks get more lean. And I think you'll see that same trend across all the formats we talk about today. But to me, I mean, standard is a perfect example of that today. And these two tournaments speak to exactly that. You haven't been particularly into standard lately, Grant, and like really playing much, but like looking at it from afar and watching the coverage, like what stood out to you?
Stands out to me is the best deck right now is a red blue deck. The best deck before was a red green deck and or a mono red deck. The best answer to this red blue deck that is now the best deck is a red blue splash white deck for premier removal. So the common denominator for me is like red just being absolutely overpowered. Like basically since Wilds of Eldraine with the printing of Monstrous Rage, red has kind of taken over standard. Obviously, we have our other like decks that are outliers, like the Pixie decks. We also have decks like Domain and Up the Beanstalk sort of pillar, but I mean, the red decks are just, they're constantly evolving, they're constantly changing. So I was reading this Commander article that was basically saying that the power of red in Commander has been significantly low in comparison to the other colors in Commander. So, like, over the course of a couple years, Wizards has been printing red into the format a little bit more, into like standard sets, Commander sets, into modern sets. Like, we saw that in MH3, a ton of just banger red cards. And like it trickles down to standard too, where we get like Monstrous Rage, then Bloomburrow, which basically created its own deck that like took over a Pro Tour. And I think that this need for Commander players to have more powerful red cards has trickled into constructed play in that way. Again, this article, I'm not totally sure if it's real or not. It was just something that I read that actually got me thinking that it could be real. Like, it kind of makes sense because red, as of the past 2 years, has been like the most dominant color in most of the constructed formats besides like Legacy and Vintage.
Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me. Like Wizards has always been trying to keep the color pie in some kind of a balance. We saw the same thing go on where they were pushing a bunch of multicolor cards around the time of like Wilds of Eldraine and Theros and stuff. And like you see back to back printings of like Oko and Uro and all that stuff when they're trying to push the green and the blue card. So, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. But I think my advice to competitive players would be that you need to be a little bit color blind when it comes to your deck choice. You need to figure out what slice of the pie is inherently powerful. And I agree with you. The red cards fundamentally in standard have been extremely powerful, proactive, efficient for the last 2 or 3 years. But I still see a lot of people who stick their head in the ground and say, oh, I don't want to play red decks. And I just think that's fundamentally the wrong attitude. Like this stuff will shift and change over time. Currently, the red cards and the blue cards are extremely good in standard, but we just don't live in a reality where they're going to ban every card until Glissa Sunslayer is the best card in standard. Like that, I know you would love that, but like that's not the reality we live in, right? And I think that the guys who show up at the RCQs and at the RC level and have figured out what the best deck is are not emotionally tied to a specific color or strategy that they think is the best. They're just trying to make an objective decision about like what the best chances are for me to be successful in the tournament. And, you know, like I said earlier, with the demographics moving as quickly as they have, I think the majority of players who are going to events at the RC level, and I think it's self-evident at the PT level that they've already figured that out, have taken that kind of like emotional layer out of the deck choice decision and just tried to make a decision about what the best deck is. And you still need to play to your strengths, right? Like it does not surprise me that Joe went to the tournament playing the most efficient cards in the blue cards. He played a bunch of the Pixie deck. He played a bunch of Storm Chasers talent. I think he's played some Phoenix in Pioneer. So like I think the Is It Prowess deck played to his strengths. And I think Casey found the deck that plays to his strengths, playing as a board control kind of control player with controlling white cards, and both found success, right? So we're not in a place where Modern was when Breach was legal, where there were like literally no choices except like play Breach or go home. I still think that there are fundamentally different strategies that you can employ in standard. They've just changed a lot since the printing of one card. And I think it's just important to realize that, especially in a card pool as small as standard, we'll get to modern and legacy in a little bit, but like a single card being printed can fundamentally warp the entire format. And I think you just got to be ready for that if you're going to play with it kind of in a competitive sense. I didn't really have any more to say on standard than that. I think if you're locked into the RCs and watching, I think it was pretty clear what the best stuff to do is. But we're kind of on hiatus now, right? We have one more event in Hartford that I know Max Garman is going to attend from our play group. I think I'm going to loan him the Is It Prowess deck. I don't know who else. Probably, I guess Joe will be there. But yeah, you know, so we'll root those guys on. But to me, that's kind of the end of the chapter of standard, and we'll kind of be on hiatus here for a little bit. And we'll get like I guess one small peek at the Pro Tour of Final Fantasy, but I'm not going to be nearly as locked in as I have been until we start over again after Modern RCQ season ends.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm happy to just move on from standard. I would say that, if I had to give it a 1 out of 10 on like format health and diversity and, things that I like about the format, it's probably like a 5 out of 10-ish. I think before Dragonstorm, it was probably like an 8 out of 10.
I think that's a totally fair assessment. I think before Tarkir, it was really good. There was a bunch of stuff you could do. Like there was pulls, right? You could kind of play the red decks on one side and the Xur decks on the other side, but there wasn't something so powerfully warping like Core Steel Cutter. But now I think that's a pretty fair assessment.
Hmm. Yep. So we'll pivot over to modern now. I mean, kind of have a lot of thoughts about modern. I like it's hard because I think modern and legacy kind of are suffering from the same problems right now, and we'll get to legacy later, and I have so much to say about that. But modern is kind of like, what happened to modern? I guess the answer is Modern Horizons 3, but we have Amulet Titan, we have Ruby Storm, we have Belcher Storm now that just took down a local RCQ. Like, we have all these decks that Eldrazi is just like 1-2-7, let's go. You have no room for error anymore in modern, which I feel like that was the format, before, where you can sort of take a turn off and just expect a whole lot of nothing. But now it's like every turn you're either trying to kill your opponent or trying to have the right piece of interaction. What do you think?
I think this is what modern has always been. So if you look at the core of the beginning of modern, right, you have Elf Ball and all the crazy stuff. They tried to ban the combo decks out of it. And then for a long time, modern in its premier form, meaning like played at the Pro Tour level or played at the highest level, always kind of was like cruise missile magic, as I call it, where people are just shooting at each other, like not trying to catch the missiles. Like you were much better off in Modern for most of its history just trying to be non-interactive and murdering your opponent as quickly as possible. There are small pieces where that wasn't true, right? If you want to look at Splinter Twin as an example, everyone loves to talk about, or if you want to talk about the Jund decks with Deathrite Shaman, they were inherently interactive. And I think in this particular format, the only viable choice for playing an interactive deck is the energy deck. That's my personal opinion. I think if you're trying to be any more reactive than that, you run into problems. Like the Frog Tide deck is inherently too reactive in its construction. I don't think any control decks are really going to have any success in this format because there's simply too many decks that are too efficient and attacking you at too many angles. I think if you looked at the format, let's call it 6, 7, 8 years ago, it was a turn four non interactive format for the most part. And now, with the new printings of everything that's gone on, we're now at a turn three non-interactive format at its default level. And I've kind of played both sides of this. 2 weeks ago at the RCQ where Amy James won, I played the Boros Energy deck for the first time in a competitive sense. And that was a much more, let's call it, mid-range interactive deck than it looks like on paper. And the absolute best draws out of that deck, the like Guide, Pride, Unjohnny Bombardment, Perfect Curve outs, don't feel like mid-range. They feel like aggro. But all the rest of the hands, let's call it the 80% of the curve, end up being interactive board removal, creature combat sort of stuff. So I think if you want to play interactive in Modern, like that's as reactive as you can get. I played that for one event. It was fine. I didn't like love it. It didn't like, the deck is extremely good. It is a pile of good cards. And I will say, by the way, I think Voice of Victory is the real deal. I will not be playing any less than three. I currently have four in my energy deck. I just think that that card does an amazing job of making the energy deck leaner in general. It gets rid of a lot of the worst draws the deck has, which is a bunch of clunky 3 drops. So like it inherently reduces the fail rate of the deck because you have a more smooth curve of mana in which to play your cards. And it's synergistic. So while Voice of Victory as its own card is not particularly powerful in a vacuum, it's good with Pride, it's good with Guide, it's good with Bombardment, it's good with a Johnny. It just simply synergizes with every other card in your deck. And you get to cut 3 drops to add 2 drops, right? Which is a thing that you're always looking to do to make your deck better. So if you want to play interactive in Modern, you can play Galvanic Discharge. Past that, I wouldn't recommend it. The second time I played an RCQ, which was last weekend, I played the Prowess deck. And my goal was to play Chorus Steel Cutter for the first time in a sanctioned event and to kill my opponent on turn three every single opportunity that I had. And I was pretty successful at it. I had 0 reps on the deck. I had never played it online. I made a bunch of errors playing the deck. Max Garman was standing behind me a couple of times. Max played Amulet. We both ended up making it to the top 4 of that event. And Max found at least 3 misplays that I had through the event where I literally missed lethal on turns when I had it. It just doesn't like register in your mind that like the correct line is sack all of your lands to deal 15 damage to your opponent. Like, you're just not used to doing that. But the deck is extremely good. And I think this is what I want to be doing in Modern right now, which is being extremely lean, being extremely efficient, and trying to kill my opponent on turn 3, and hopefully figuring out a way to like fight back on the draw, in game 2 if I come that, or game 3 when we're on the draw. So I think Modern is just, another symptom of everyone's paying attention to what's going on Magic Online. Everyone is coming to the tournaments with what's have been conceived as the best decks. And as Modern currently stands, the threats are better than the answers. So you better be trying to kill your opponent. So I don't know. That's my high level thoughts on Modern. I think you've played Frogtide and a couple other different things. Do you see it any differently?
I mean, well, I agree with most of what you're saying. I also played the Frog deck, which is like a highly reactive deck. I played that at Grandmaster Games, the same RCQ we're talking about with Amy taking it down. I was really excited to play that deck because it played like all of the cards that I really love to play, like in Legacy, Bowmasters, Tamiyo, Murktide Regent, Counterspell's a dope card. I got a really beautiful set of counterspells I was excited to dust off. Kaito is another great card. So I was excited to play this deck, and things started off pretty well for me. I mean, I 2-0'd my first two rounds. One of them was Control, the other one was the Mirror. And then I played against Nolan on Belcher, and like it's traditionally not that great for the Frog deck, but I was able to push it to a really close game three. But game three, Nolan missed like land drops 6 times in a row and still won because I couldn't turn around a threat or a clock. I just drew like lands and like counter spells and like lands and counter spells. If I had found a frog in the first even 4 turns of him missing all of these land drops, I think I just win that game on the spot. But the deck, if it doesn't align correctly to what the game is asking of you, the deck is absolutely atrocious. When the game does align to everything that you have in your hand and like your capabilities, I think it's like the best deck in modern. But the fact of the matter is it's gonna take a crap more than it's gonna be like the best it can be, which is, unfortunate. But like it's crazy when you take away cards like Brainstorm and Ponder from decks like that, the continuity of the deck drops so fast.
And, the other thing that I think people don't realize is the RCQ that I played on Saturday was 35 players, which dictated that we play 6 rounds of Swiss and then 3 rounds in the top 8. So to win the event, you literally need to play 9 rounds of Magic and come out on top in at least 3-0 the last 3 matches that you play. And to do that in a reactive stance in this format where people are going to be trying to red Belcher you, blue Belcher you, prowess lava dart you, amulet you, Eldrazi smash you. Like I just think is a fundamentally flawed strategy for going into this format. So, if anyone's out there listening and trying to figure out what to do for modern RCQ season, and you lay out your deck on the table and if you look at the difference in the 3 piles of land cards, answers, and threats. And if your threats pile isn't the giantest pile on the table, I would rethink kind of, what you're trying to do here in modern RCQ season, because it's going to be almost impossible to have all of the right answers line up for 9 rounds in a row.
I agree, which is why I think if I do get the chance to play another RCQ this season, which I'm hoping I'll be able to squeeze it in, but it's not looking super great with how tight my calendar's getting. But I'm gonna play like either Ruby Storm or the Belcher deck. I mean, I think I'm like 4 Stormscale Scions and 4 Ironcrag feats away from just like having the Belcher deck. And like that deck looked unbelievable. Bryant Cook dropped a video today of a undefeated 5-0 that he had. The video was 30 minutes long, and I think of that 30 minutes, 26 minutes of it was actual gameplay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So I took a loss somewhere in the Swiss. I can't remember. It's kind of a mix. But anyway, I ended up being 4-1 at the end of round 5, and I sit down against Freddie, who's a nice guy that I don't think I'd ever played before. And we were at table 1 at the RCQ, and he goes, "Oh, do you want to split?" And I was like, "Well, no, not really. Actually, I would like to play because I'm on the prowess deck." And my thought process was the top tables at this particular RCQ were full of energy players, and I had taken one loss to Dylan. That's right, on energy, where I actually misplayed because I forgot that you could actually attach Core Steel Cutter to your creatures manually. Amazing secret mode. Anyway, I had lost one round to energy, and I said, no, I want to play the last round. So I ended up winning that round against the red Belcher deck against Freddie. And I very skillfully won the die roll. I killed my opponent on turn 3. I was able to mutagenic growth and save my creature from his spike field hazard, and then was able to kill him on the crashback on the play on either turn 3 or 4. Then he killed me in game 2 with Ritual into Belcher on turn 3. And on game 3, when I was back on the play, I killed him on turn 3 with a quick hand. So that deck is very scary, I would agree, but that's exactly the kind of stuff you want to be doing. I don't really have an opinion, Grant, on whether the red Belcher deck or the Storm deck is better. I think you should probably play the one you're more comfortable with, but like that's the type of Magic you should be trying to play. And if you want to like storm off a bunch of dragons, then like yeah, more power to you. You know, that card is sweet.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the Belcher deck is probably stronger right now, especially with the existence of the quad Relic of Progenitus Orzhov Sewers deck. The Belcher deck has two win conditions: either make a ton of big dumb dragons and give them haste with Bitter Reunion, or Goblin Char Belcher activation. So it's two very different win conditions. One's combat, one's an activated ability. Neither of them use the graveyard. And the deck also just gets to play Blood Moon in the main, which is kind of dope.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to make a note on the Ketramos deck in Modern because I haven't really been paying that much attention to it, but I did notice that recently, even this week, there have been some challenge wins, and they did the same thing that you always do to make decks better. They cut out a bunch of clunky 3 drops and they added all the 1 drops. So the black white decks that are winning this week on MTGO are running 4 Guide of Souls and 4 Ocelot Pride to give you an efficient kind of 1-2 punch at the very bottom of their curve, as opposed to playing a bunch of, flicker wisps and aether vials and, skyclave apparitions. They cut all that stuff and put Guide and Pride, Phalia, Overlord, Ketramos, Relic, Killia. So again, that's a deck that has been made more efficient so that its mana curve looks like the energy deck, and where the Ketramos deck kind of has the Ketramos and Blinking Overlord top end, where the energy deck has the Flage top end. Those decks are now kind of very similar in how they're trying to interact with the format. And then I think the same the problem is that the black white deck, the Ketramos deck, is just fundamentally slower than the energy deck. So I think it's a little behind on the curve. So what they've ended up doing is the same thing I did with my energy deck. They're splashing, I believe, a Hallowed Fountain to play 4 Consigned to Memories in their sideboard to try to shore up those combo matchups. So yeah, I mean, I think that that all kind of makes sense to me, but it's also fun to see these decks like evolve into like lean, mean murdering machines, even though they kind of look like Death and Taxes dirtily decks. Like they're really not. They're really trying to play like a bunch of stuff on turn 1 and 2 that you really can't beat. So, welcome to Modern in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that its time was coming to where it needed to just play the best MH3 cards it could. I think that whole deck is basically all the threat suite is MH3 or earlier, or I guess most recent sets. So it's like MH3 and on is like that whole deck.
Well, don't forget Solitude, MH2.
Oh, well, yeah, sorry, my bad. I forgot about the other most powerful set ever printed in the modern.
Yeah. 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 It is kind of funny though to look at it, right? Because like the MH sets definitely have a stated goal, right? And one of the stated goals of MH2 was to try to make the answers at least comparable to the threats. They printed all the free spells, the furies and the subtleties and the griefs, which ended up being, not as great, and the endurances and stuff. And like all of those cards were the most powerful cards for the most part in the set. And they were very clearly answers to things. So they very, how do you say this? Like specifically targeted trying to push the answers to be more powerful in modern. And there's a lot of people who think that post MH2 modern was a really good spot for the format. You can debate that all you want, but MH3 again was fundamentally different. They pushed the threats again, right? That's where we get the guides and the prides and the phalias and all the stuff that came with, very clearly they were pushing the white cards and they were very clearly pushing the creatures. And so now we're back into a place where the threats in the format are just fundamentally higher on rate than the answers are. And in these types of formats, like that's just what you have to do. And I think we've kind of come to consensus on the black white deck and the red white deck being the way to play interactive in the format with a bunch of 1 drops so that you maintain kind of like a nut draw on the very bottom, and then the rest of the decks in the format all kind of circulating around how fast they can kill their opponent on turn 3 or 4. So I just think if you're honest with yourself about what modern is, that you can definitely be successful. I think it's a much better format personally than the breach format, where there was only one fundamental strategy that you are allowed to play, I think there's a bunch of viable decks in modern, honestly. I think there's at least 5 or 6 decks that you can justify in your mind to show up and play with, but they need to be efficient and they need to be fast.
Well, I mean, that's where I think I have to disagree. I think that that makes modern worse in my mind because of those four or five decks that you're talking about, only one of them is like reactively viable. The rest are it's like prowess, bonk, Titan, bonk, Belcher, bonk, like all of these decks that are just going to smoke you in the first few turns of the game. Like that to me isn't like the sign of a good modern format. And like that used to be the old like stigma around Legacy. Well, Legacy's a turn three format. Modern's a turn three format now too. Like, what's really the difference other than Modern gets to do everything they want because they're not haltered by things like Days, Wasteland, and Force of Will. So
You can argue about what makes a format healthy or not, and you can like the play patterns or not. But I will just say there is at least deck and strategy diversity. You can play the black white deck or the red white deck if you want to be reactive, and then you can murder your opponent any other number of ways. So again, you can argue about whether diversity is more important than gameplay or how long the games take or whatever, but at least on that metric, it has fundamentally shifted from where we were 3 months ago, where there really was only one deck that was playable, in my opinion, at a high level event.
yeah, and I think that I don't really care that much about like diversity in formats. I care more about the gameplay of the formats. And just because we have 10 different options, if all of them are operating at 1,000 miles per hour, what are we really doing? That just means we're just dice rolling for the match, in most cases, right? So to me, that's a lot less fun than like having formats of like maybe three or four decks, but like we're gonna play to turn 10, turn 12, turn 15. It's gonna be like a Delver mirror. It's gonna be like an Is It Murktide mirror, to use the modern example here. Like stuff like that. I thought modern was great when we had mirrors like that, but and like Death Shadow too. And Death Shadow was great in modern. Like I loved that format, but that also was when Luris was legal. So that should probably be a little careful about how much I say I like that format.
Yeah, well, a lot of us who played Luris really did like it, but obviously it was out of bounds. I will say the other antithesis to this is like when I went to the first RCQ at Grandmaster Games, I had never played the energy deck before. Obviously, I had watched it plenty, but going through the motions yourself and remembering all the triggers and doing all that stuff is obviously a learning experience. And in round one, I got paired into the mirror, and like it was a 45-minute slog that went 10 turns a bunch of times. So if you want to do that, then I would say that you should play the Ketramos deck or the Flage deck because those are the two decks that at least have the option to play 8 turns. And a lot of the pseudo mirrors of those will be that long. I personally don't want to play a deck where there's 27 rectangles on the table. Like that's just not for me. But if that's what you want, those are your two options, I think.
Yeah, and I do think that good gameplay exists. I think that good gameplay exists in like all the formats, but I think that when you look at the very top of the mountain of at least modern and legacy, it's just so toxic. Like it's not fun. I don't particularly enjoy like showing up just to play combo mirrors all the time, and that's coming from a guy who's like the combo guy for the most part. I do love playing me some combo, but when everyone like if we're only going to play 15 minutes of Magic and then I got to sit around for 45 minutes, I'm not having a good time. And that
Well,
goes both ways too. Like I just spent the last 3 weeks playing Oops All spells, and like I didn't enjoy winning in 5 minutes and then like sitting around for an hour waiting for my next round to where I get to basically do the exact same shit over again. That's not fun.
Well, we'll get to legacy in a second because I think we're about done with modern. But I think Oops is the ultimate expression of that. And I think probably the source of a lot of your bitterness because you got to like live that and like wear the helmet to FNM. But, I actually, of all the decks that are possible to kill you on turn 3 in modern, Prowess is by far my favorite, not only because I like blue red decks, even though I do. You are playing Lightning Bolt, you are playing Lavadar. Like the matches that I played of Prowess against Energy were extremely tight. The games were all excellent. We went to 3 every time, and it was a back and forth brawl, digging for my graveyard hate after board to deal with Flage, figuring out like where I point my removal, whether I pointed at the board or I pointed at them or whatever. So, that's the reason I really, really enjoy the prowess deck in modern right now, even though the games are fast. It feels like all your decisions really matter. And there is a lot of choice and interaction available in that deck specifically, which is why I personally would play it over something like Amulet or Belcher that is literally has no interactive cards. The prowess deck kind of blends that line where like you can choose to interact with your opponent's board if you want to. A bunch of your cards do that, but sometimes it's better just to go after them. And I think that decision tree is something I really enjoy. So, for the foreseeable future, I'll be playing the prowess deck in modern. I think it's really fun to play.
Well, good. I mean, I'm glad that you found something that doesn't require you to play battle cruiser magic or cruise missile magic or whatever you called it. Because I was sitting here while you were talking, and I was trying to think of all the decks that kill on turn three in modern, and I got Belcher, two colors of Belcher, Ruby Storm, Abzan combo, Amulet Titan. What else? What else kills on three in 3 turns possibly? Oh,
Mm,
Brood Scale combo. I'm gonna put Tron in there too because like throwing down a 7 drop on turn three is lethal most of the time.
I think putting Eldrazi in that camp is totally reasonable. Like there's a bunch of those starts where your opponent goes like Ugin Labyrinth, make a talisman, play another. They have 5 mana on turn 2 and 7 or 8 mana on turn 3. And the game is fundamentally over if they get to do that and you don't interact. So I think that's a totally fair statement. But yeah, that's the state of the format. That's where we are.
Yeah, well, I mean, are you? Actually, let me give my modern grading. I'm gonna give modern a 3 out of 10 personally. I don't know if you want to give it a few more points, but that's where I'm at.
Oh yeah, I totally disagree. I think modern's about a 7 out of 10, which is I get grading against other moderns, right? I'm not trying to compare it to standard or limited or legacy, whatever. But for modern, I think this is about what modern normally is. And there is deck diversity, and I think there is choice, and I think all of the colors of the color pie are available to play if you want to choose to do that. So I think modern is in a place, and whether you choose to like it or not. I've spent 10 years of my life disliking modern because of this reason, but now I've changed my fundamental philosophy and I've just come to accept that this is what modern is, and and now I've really enjoyed it. So I give it a 7 out of 10.
Ban things until Llanowar Elves is good, and unban Glimpse of Nature. That'll be the last thing I say. So, okay, now we got to talk about Legacy. I, I'm gonna give my Legacy grade before we even get into this. I'm giving it a 2 out of 10. And for reference here, the white initiative format, I'm giving a 1 out of 10. That's like where my sliding scale is. I also didn't play when Underworld Breach was legal for two weeks or whatever, but it's besides the point.
Nobody did.
I'm very down on Legacy. Yeah, I guess that's true. It was over COVID, but very down on Legacy right now. The number one deck in Legacy is at 10% play rate online. It sweeps all spells. I try to do my best to be playing the best deck possible at all times, and it led me to be playing this deck for about 3 weeks. And I think it like fundamentally rewired my brain to hate Legacy. Like that's probably the best way to put it. Is like all your wins were miserable and all your losses were like even worse. And it's just like no one has fun. It's the deck that you should be playing too. It beats all the hate. I mean, if you are running hot on a given day and you also are playing Oops, there's no reason why you should not be able to like 5-0 Swiss and then win an event.
So let's be a little more surgical here. Tell the users who are out there thinking about trying to win their next legacy tournament, whether it's the Duel for Duels here in town or something else coming up. Why is the deck so resilient? And what did you learn kind of going down that rabbit hole that lets you kind of, let's say, take control of the metagame here locally for at least a couple of weeks?
Yeah, so Oops All Spells is a deck that has no lands in it. And that's important because there's 2 creatures in the deck, 4 copies of each that we would refer to as Oops creatures, but they're actually called Undercity Informer and Value Strayed Spy. Upon resolution of these effects, Undercity Informer's 3 mana and 1 to activate, and then Balustrade Spy is 4 mana and triggers on ETB, but their effects are the same. Target player mills until they hit a land. So you don't have any lands in your deck. So what this means is that when you target yourself with either of these effects, you mill your entire deck. What that does, though, is it effectively gives you a hand of 12 cards, is like kind of a good way to put it, I think. From the gameplay's perspective, once you resolve this effect, you'll have somewhere between 1 and 4 Narcomoeba triggers that go on the stack. Narcomoeba is 1 and a blue, it's a flyer, and whenever it enters the graveyard from the library, it enters the battlefield. It creates a trigger that enters the battlefield. So the build that I ran, we're going to use that as the example. I ran 2 Narcomoebas. So whenever I resolved my Oops effect, 2 Narcomoeba triggers would go on the stack. Once they resolve, I get to Cabal Therapy my opponent twice. And what Cabal Therapy does, I don't know if you want me to explain every single card because I could be here all day, but effectively, I'm going to rip your hand apart, and then I'm going to Dread Return Authorical. And Poxwalkers is another key part of the combo where whenever you cast something out of the graveyard, they trigger and they also enter play. So it's infinite fodder for your Cabal Therapies and your Dread Returns, is what Poxwalkers does. It's also a win it's like a third win condition because the first win condition is Dread Return your Thoracle. Your second win condition is to Memory Journey a Doomsday pile of 3 cards, basically, which is some combination of Lotus Petal, Thoracle, or in the case of Endurance, it can be like Dark Ritual, and then another Oops All Spells effect. But and then the third one there would be Poxwalkers. So that they're 3/1s with Death Touch, so they just attack through everything. What makes this
And
deck so resilient is like individually targeted hate pieces like Surgical Extraction or Fairy Macabre don't necessarily work because you have a card called Memory's Journey. So if my Narcomoeba triggers go on the stack and you try to Surgical one of them, I can Memory's Journey the one that you're targeting back into my library and then continue to resolve the rest of the effects that I have in the graveyard. Now, if you Fairy Macabre both of them, I can still Memory's Journey, triggering 3 Poxwalkers to have fodder for my Cabal Therapies and Dread Returns. If you were to respond to them with an effect like a Relic of Progenitus or insert graveyard bombing effect here, I can basically from there just Memory's Journey and do the same thing. So Poxwalkers enters, I make a little Doomsday pile of Thassa's Oracles, and then you have 3 turns. So the deck's also supported by cards like Pact of Negation, Thoughtseize, Cabal Therapy 2 in the main deck. So really what this means is there's key pieces of like interaction that actually matter. I think Leyline of the Void and Grafdigger's Cage are your 2 strongest options. Both are weak to Force of Vigor. The Oops All Spells players know this. So they're usually rolled up with 4 copies of Force of Vigor in the sideboard because they have 4 Disciple of Freyleys, 3 Once Upon a Time, 4 Elvish Spirit Guides, and I'm trying to think of any other green cards. That might be it. They're pretty thin on green cards, but it doesn't matter because all you got to do is resolve a Force of Vigor once to be able to complete your combo. Individual hate pieces, like I mentioned, Surgical Extraction, Fairy Macabre, Agatha Soul Cauldron, Unlicensed Hearse, whatever, they're not great. Graveyard bombing effects like Nihil Spellbomb, Relic of Progenitus, they're not great. The only real key way to stop the deck from doing the combo is by having a static ability like a Grafdigger's Cage or a Leyline of the Void. I'm going to take a deep breath there, Lee. What do we think?
that was a good overview. I think, if you're not familiar with all the cards, obviously you can go on MTG Goldfish and kind of look at it. But to me, the thing that's the most inherently broken about it is, like Grant said, you put your entire deck in the graveyard, and then you have filled your deck with a bunch of free spells. Basically, right? Cabal Therapy is a free spell because you get to sacrifice creatures that come back for free. Dread Return is a free spell because you get to sacrifice creatures that come back for free. Poxwalkers are coming back for free. So, like, the only spell really that you need to spend any mana on is 1 green for Memory's Journey, which at the same time protects you from all the relevant hate pieces. I agree that this deck is problematic. I agree that something probably needs to be done for the health of the format because the answers to this are too narrow and too random. And it is just not a fun play experience for anybody. So I would hope at least that some action will be taken against this deck when we get to June at the BNR. It's just a negative play experience all around. I did want to shout out one card that I found kind of effective in the play session that we played. One of the weeks that you were there on Oops, I played the stock up deck that Harain had played, which was a blue-white Dreadnought or Phyrexian Dreadnought deck. And the Clarion Conqueror card from Dragonstorm was a very effective hate piece that I found. It's probably too slow in any decks that aren't playing both Force of Will and Ancient Tomb, which is a pretty narrow window of decks currently. But that particular deck played both Ancient Tomb and Tundra in it. And I thought, all of the games that I got to basically resolve Clarion Conqueror, which is, I think the text on it, 3/3 flyer for 2 and a white. It says activated abilities of artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers cannot be activated. So it's kind of like a flying null rod and a curse totem all in one. That card seemed very good against Oops, but there's just so few decks that I think can actually play it.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because I think that that actually might be one of the most all-encompassing cards to stop Oops in the post-board games too. Because when Oops moves to the board plan, I mean, there's a few different ways that the deck can board because it has all the options, Lee. It can do all of the things that it wants to do. You just got to pick a plan, basically. And I chose the Goblin Charbelcher plan, which Clarion Conqueror also shuts that off.
The other reason I really like that card is I believe the other best deck in the format is the Cephalid Breakfast Nadu deck that James at the local store plays and Larson won Eternal Weekend Europe with and continues to win MTGO challenges with. That deck has been a consistent top performer for a long time. I think it's the most difficult deck in the format to sideboard against. I was talking to James about this. He beat me yesterday at Legacy playing, basically Cephalid plus Nomads in game one on the play. And then on the draw, we played a longer, kind of, drawn out game and I got beat by Nadu. So I think that Clarion Conqueror is extremely good also against that deck. So I'm kind of looking for a way to play that card because it seems to shore up some of the most powerful, difficult matchups in the format. It's not quite as good against Breakfast because they play Plow and Ending, but it's a card to keep an eye out on.
I mean, I like it. And Breakfast is another example of another Dread Return deck, just kind of making the format pretty fucking miserable. I don't know. I'm trying not to be super down on it, but I just think that every time we get a new set or something else happens within Magic, it's like we're just getting more busted crap that just ends up turning Legacy into this just combo centric format. But I have to sort of contradict myself here because the meta share, when you actually look at the whole Goldfish breakdown, if you ignore the decks that are actually at the top and like you're not like, oh my god, 10% oops all spells, it's pretty diverse. And like the tempo decks are occupying about 20% of the meta share, which is basically where we want them. Like that's a sign of a healthy format. But it just doesn't feel that way to me because I'm really tired of oops all spells. I'm also really tired of breakfast. Like that's kind of turning into like a personally hated deck for me because it just always feels like they just have everything and it never feels like they have all of the garbage cards they have to play in their hand. But that might just be my own experience. And also, Cavern of Souls is a cop.
Yeah, I lost to Cavern of Souls naming wizard, in the second game that I played. So I feel you there. I would, again, if I had my druthers, I'd have banned both Entomb and Dread Return on this last cycle, and I think we'd be in a different spot. I know you have to run here in a minute, but I'm just going to do one last little piece here. I played the blue black reanimator deck yesterday. It wasn't perfectly built. I have a couple of iterations I want to make, but that deck felt, again, unsurprisingly, extremely strong and extremely good. Just has a very fair plan of Tameo Bowmasters and a very unfair plan of Entomb Reanimate into Atraxa Archon. And I think if I had to, sleeve up a deck to try to go win a tournament tomorrow, that I'd probably be back playing the Blue Black Reanimator deck, which, again, I've been in that same position for 2 years. So I can understand your pessimism.
Yeah, and like my last piece on this is that WotC is just always 6 months behind. I do think that we should continue this conversation on another podcast episode, but I think we're running up to the hour mark here. Plus, I also have to bounce. But maybe we make this a part one State of the Union and we try and do a part two some other time this week too, whenever your availability opens up.
Yep, sounds good. I'm glad we just got to sit down and talk. It's been too long, but maybe we'll have a couple here in the future, in a short time. I have some big legacy events and modern events coming up. I'm going to play the Duel for Duels hopefully where we get to go down to Colorado Springs and try to win a dual land. I'm going to play the MMS at the very last MMS of the year is also an RCQ for Modern at the end of May. So I'll be playing Modern there for RCQ season. And then I think I'm going to make the trip up to Columbus, Ohio to play the Buffalo Chicken Dip Legacy. I believe it's the first weekend in August. The winner of the Legacy event wins a Mox Jet. So I'm kind of in for trying to go spike a Mox. I don't know if I know you're probably tight on time and resources in August, but if anybody else locally is looking for someone to go up with, I think I'm going to be in Columbus, Ohio to try to win a Mox. So
Well, if you want to borrow Oops All Spells, you're more than welcome to.
very much appreciated.
All right, well, we'll wrap it there, y'all. Thank you.
Yep. Cheers. Talk to you guys later.